Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we haven't had one of our dedicated armor shows for quite some time. Well, we've got two this week, and they are both about tank development. Today, we are looking at the US, and our guest is Matthew Long, former tank crewman and history graduate. And then later in the week, we have Phil Knight coming on to talk about British tank development. And I'm really intrigued to know how much they will dovetail and how much they will be different to each other. But that's the interesting thing. But I'll bring Matthew in now. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Excellent. Yourself?
I'm good. So, as a new guest, I always like to ask a new guest kind of how they define themselves, because, graduate of history, but also experience playing around with the real green machines. Do you have a particular label you like to refer to yourself as?
Sure. I think I would define myself as a cultural historian, and I'm interested specifically in military technology and that sort of relationship that the technology and the end user have, and how these users sort of look at themselves and find their place in a world as these technologies mature and advance.
I mean, it's a good thing, and it's that whole question of does technology dictate the way people fight, or the way people fight dictate the technology, or is it probably a combination of both? But we've got a massive PowerPoint we're going to go through today, folks. What we're going to do today with regards questions is probably do the majority of them at the end, kind of the thematic ones about what the lessons learned, that kind of thing. But if there are specific questions about the information on screen, we can deal with them as we go along. But I'm pretty certain that everything you're thinking is going to come up, probably will come up in some shape or form. So I'm going to hand over to Matthew to take us through this. And as always, folks, click like and subscribe and share what we're doing on social media. But over to you, sir.
All right, cool. So this is kind of going to look at the track of U.S. Tank development from the end of the First World War until the eve of the Second. And so our story begins in 1919 with the kind of the state of the United States Army at the end of that war. The American Expeditionary Forces remained in Europe after the armistice on November 11th, 1918, particularly to supervise German demobilization and disarmament. But during this time, the Army also formed a superior board to establish a record of lessons learned from the Great War. It was comprised of General Pershing and 6 other field grade officers who we're not going to talk about because they don't really play that big of a role. The important thing is what they found regarding tanks. So they thought that tanks are required by an armed force if by no other reason than the morale boost to friendly troops and the demoralizing effect on the enemy. They thought that tanks could support infantry assaults to objectives, but they were very adamant that tanks couldn't operate independently. There's a quote in there, there is no such thing as an independent tank attack. And by that line of logic, tanks must belong to the infantry. So I have a quote from George C. Marshall of the Marshall Plan. And this is in reference to sort of this United States Army drawdown and demobilization following the First World War. And he said, quote, "I saw the Army start rapidly on the downgrade to almost extinction. His views," that being General Pershing's, "didn't count at all," end quote. That's not entirely true. So, Pershing put together the Superior Board, and when he sent it off to the Secretary of War to be evaluated, he added an addendum because some of his findings were different than that of the board, and he wanted to be sure that his opinions were read. And one of the things that he specifically wrote is that whatever the requirements of a war in Europe, a division for war on this continent should not exceed a strength of 20,000 and should preferably be less. So that gets sent off to the War Department, and they listen. They acted upon the Superior Board's report, and we get the National Defense Act of 1920. And among other things, one of the key aspects here is that it reduces the size of the regular army to just 280,000 soldiers. There is a reduction in budget as well. The total military budget for 1920 was a little bit more than $500 million. So half of that goes to the Navy, half of that goes to the Army. So we're looking at, about $290 million there, which seems like a lot, but if you take into account how much money it takes to equip, feed, house, clothe a standing army, that's no money. That's pocket change. And in fact, there's a report, a budgetary report for 1920, saying that they expect a decrease in the operating cost in 1921 for tanks and tractors from $81,455 just down to $25,000. And so this operating cost, this is fuel, oil, all the consumables that go into operating any kind of motorized equipment. So you can see all of that is on the downgrade. And in fact, if you read over what the budgets were allowing for, the Army seemed more interested in developing the air service than anything to do with tanks. One of the other things that it did was created the Chief of Arms, and this is kind of like a branch chief, just one field grade officer who is responsible for the doctrine, training, education of their specific set of troops. And so we get the Chief of Artillery of the Coastal Artillery Corps, the Corps of Engineers, the Signal Corps, Aeronautics, Cavalry, and the Infantry. And of course, the Infantry took sole ownership of tanks. So at this time as well, the U.S. Cavalry was in the midst of an identity crisis. They had barely taken part in the First World War. And in fact, only the 2nd Cav Regiment deployed with the AEF, and they did serve with distinction. But in the face of Army reorganization and drawdowns, most cavalrymen felt like they had to justify their own continued existence. As such, they were chiefly concerned with getting back to the traditions and skills which allowed them to be an important independent force. And if you can see there, some of the text I've highlighted, Major General Leonard Wood, who was the cavalry chief at the time, he pens an article in the Cavalry Journal, which starts out, "The cavalryman must know how to use his saber." This is what they were concerned about. They wanted to get back to sort of that traditional esprit de corps that made them, in their minds anyway, the cavalry. And anyone with any experience around tanks in the First World War, they wouldn't have thought that the tank was going to replace the mounted cavalryman anytime soon. And then they were right. Tanks were a new technology. They were prone to breaking down. They were nearly blind, and they were seemingly only good to push assaults. No soldier would have said that a tank as it was in 1918 or 1919 could have done a cavalryman's job. The cycle of these technologies maturation is slow, and it's not just in the U.S., but it was in Europe as well. Everyone is trying to figure out what this technology can do. No one had any clear idea of what tanks were supposed to do doctrinally, how they were supposed to do it, who was going to be in charge of them. And then you add to that this technology is in its infancy, and you can see how this is it's a 20-year-long process to figure out. Now, it can be argued, and certainly plenty of people do, that the U.S. should have made quicker strides to full mechanization in the second half of the 1930s, when it did become apparent that mechanization was the way to go. But to be fair, the chief culprit in the 1920s and in the early 30s was money, experience, and the lack of any sort of proper doctrine. There's also this idea that the United States slow armor development rests firmly on the shoulders of the cavalry. And they're described as refusing to give up their horses when the world was meeting the future with this mechanized force. And there is some truth in that, but with most things in history, it's a little bit more complicated. In the early stages of mechanization, cavalrymen who wrote about tanks thought that they were handy to have for specific missions and in specific circumstances, but that the tank should just stick with the infantry, who the cavalry already deemed as ponderously slow. Or they should form an entirely new branch that was dedicated to accomplishing missions that tanks would do. And they weren't the only ones, the cavalrymen anyway, who thought this. Here we have a young Dwight D. Eisenhower writing an article where he essentially agrees with Patton that tanks were useful if used in the right way. And then he goes on to describe the ways in which he thinks it can be useful. We see an argument generally between infantry and cavalry throughout these military journals that, tanks weren't going to go anywhere, but how do we use them? And the main point of contention here is kind of tied to the existential dread experienced by cavalrymen fighting for their proverbial lives to remain mounted on horseback. All of the discourse seems short-sighted because at the time, the tanks in the Army inventory were this one, the M1917, which was a licensed-built copy of the French Renault light tank, and it was armed with either a machine gun or a short 37mm gun, pitifully slow, not very much armor, but it was the foundational design template for all, quote, modern tanks, although no one knew this yet. And just real quick, the main difference between this and the actual French FT is mostly the engine. The exhaust is on the left side on the American version, it's on the right side on the French version, and some other minor differences, but I'm not going to get bogged down in details. The other tank that the Army had was this is the Mark 8, otherwise known as the Liberty tank. This was a joint venture between Britain and the US to develop a common tank if the war were to extend past 1918. And it's a clever bit of British social engineering as well, because it serves two functions. It gives the Americans some experience in building tanks, and it also ensures that tanks built by Britain would go to British units. But as you can clearly see from the design, it's built for trench warfare. It's got that long lozenge-shaped hull with the wraparound track and the side sponson guns designed for fighting in trenches. It was not going to be the tank of the future. And by 1920, it was pretty much obsolete anyway. The Army also had a bunch of the Ford 3 tons, but we're not going to get into that. They're worse than useless, and I don't really feel like getting into the nuts and bolts of it. So clearly the Army needs some new tanks, right? But what kind of tank? What would it look like? What would it do? What did it need to do? After the conclusion of hostilities, the Army put together a caliber board to set down the basic design criteria. They thought it should be of medium size, replacing both the light and heavy types. And now Colonel Robert Ix, who went on to have a career as a prolific author on the subject of armored warfare, and he was a personal friend of former Bovington Tank Museum curator Richard Ogorkowitz. He reported on the board's plan in a 1937 article in the Ordnance Journal. And he thinks that the resulting series of medium tanks that we're about to talk about set the pace of tank development back by several years by trying to make one tank that was supposed to do the job of two different tanks. The chief concerns of the board as relayed to the Ordnance Department was that the new tank had to have a high tactical mobility and increased firepower. What you'll notice is that protection, which is the third side of that armored triangle, is, noticeably absent. So we can draw the conclusion that what the Army wanted was a light, speedy, hard-punching tank that could traverse difficult terrain. And we ask ourselves, why are these the design criteria? And it's pretty simple. This is a image of the entire nation of France superimposed on the contiguous United States. It's tiny, right? The entire span of France, north to south, is the same distance as Kansas City, Missouri, to Colorado Springs, Colorado. The action on the front was just a quarter of the American southern border, which will become important here in a second. The United States at the start of the 1920s had around 3 million miles of roads spread out over 3.8 million square miles. So we've got less than a mile of road per square mile of territory. There's huge stretches of undeveloped wilderness and very rough country. By contrast, France's road network is much more dense, and France had the densest rail network in Europe with 37,000 miles, even after the First World War, and it would remain the densest in Europe until the mid-1930s. And France, of course, had just over 200,000 square miles of land area. That makes for a 17% in rail coverage. If you look at the US numbers, we had just 230,000 miles of rail for 3.8 million square miles of territory. That's 7% coverage. So tanks weren't going to be able to get to where the fight might be by road nor by rail. So you couldn't have these big, slow, behemoths trudging along at 3 miles an hour that would get to the battlefield via rail or by truck. They had to get there on their own. They had to get there unsupported by a logistics train. They had to arrive in good enough condition to enter a fight. And they had to bring to bear enough firepower to be able to support these infantrymen in taking these objectives. The terrain dictated that the cavalry might use trucks, maybe some armored cars, but mostly they're going to be on horses. The main defense concern at the time was that southern border, and that's horse territory and had been for 100 years. No one in their right mind would think that an automobile, anything motorized, was going to be able to handle the kinds of terrain that horses routinely did. And a lot of the writing that we see in these military journals is to that effect. Everyone kind of has the same agreement that as of the very early 1920s, there's no machine made by man that was going to beat a horse going cross country. Well, in 1919, J. Walter Christie optioned his new convertible tank to the Army. Christie's tank was highly unique, very unorthodox, and it was special because it could run either on its road wheels or on its tracks. You could just take the tracks off, store them somewhere, and you can drive it around like an automobile. And the Army was already fairly familiar with Christie. He had built some tracked artillery tractors before, and those were tested for the Army. The Army declined on accepting any of them into service for various reasons. But he'd also reached some civilian acclaim by racing cars in the early 1900s, and he wanted to set a land speed record, and he had this very unique front-wheel drive car. So he was already fairly well known at the time. So R.P. Honeycutt, in his magnum opus series, he puts the M1919 as delivered and accepted to Aberdeen Proving Ground in January of 1921. But this is an Army Ordnance program for a demonstration to be taking place in October of 1920. And down at the bottom, sandwiched between some other demonstrations, is the new Christie tank, which is probably the M1919. But the really interesting thing about the program, if we look at it from a cultural perspective, we try and look at what the primary document can tell us. Look how far down the tank demonstration. There's two tank demonstrations: the demonstration of the 35-ton, which is probably the Mark 8, and the new Christie tank. And they're on the last morning of the demonstration, and they're sandwiched between the firing of this ridiculous 240 millimeter howitzer and then aerial bombing. The stuff that comes before that, all the good stuff, are big artillery cannons, demonstrations of aircraft, and then you have meetings and technical moving pictures, which wraps up Friday with a vaudeville smoker or whatever that is. But yeah, the tanks are down at the very bottom. You know, and if you've ever been to any kind of one of these conventions or shows, being sort of near the bottom of the last day is not a great place. It's not where you want to be. You're not headlining down there. But at least it beat out the tractor tug of war, which is the last item listed down there. So we're moving into 1921. And if we were thinking about that flow chart we saw a couple slides ago, and I'll go back so we can refresh ourselves. That flow chart kind of talks about how design criteria are initiated and then filtered down through the various offices and branches to get to a final user product. So if we're thinking about that, the head of the tank school, Samuel Rockenbach, who is considered the father of like U.S. armor, he, along with Ordnance Department Major R.E. Carleton, set forth design requirements for the Army's new medium tank. It couldn't exceed 18 tons. It needed to have a power to weight ratio of 10 horsepower per ton, and an average speed of 12 miles an hour. So the idea was for a tank which would excel at relatively quick maneuvers across open country. What they got was this. This is the M1921, which is one of two pilot tanks for this design. It was 20 tons. It could only do 10 miles an hour, and it was armed with a 57 millimeter cannon and a rotating turret and a Browning 30 cal and a commander's cupola. And it's a pretty close approximation of the British medium Mark D, which we're going to get into here in a second. The second tank, this is the medium M1922. This is the second pilot tank. A little bit different. It's essentially similar to the 1921, except for the Army kind of looked across the pond and noticed that the British were doing some neat things with suspension. And up until this point, every tank that the United States Army had ever played with were unsprung, no suspension. So you feel every bump in the road. You have to come to a complete stop before firing a cannon or even machine guns. You're not going to hit anything. So having a cable sprung suspension seemed like a great idea for a tank that's supposed to be assaulting things quickly. It's supposed to be, you know, highly maneuverable, but it's essentially lifted directly from the medium Mark D. And this is a trend that we're going to keep seeing. The United States will keep looking to the Brits for inspiration and guidance on trying to figure out how to build tanks. And so kind of this peeking at your neighbor's answer strategy shows a couple things. The United States, they weren't wildly flailing about with their tank designs, as is sometimes attributed to them. You know, they're not throwing spaghetti at the wall. They're making choices based on information they had at the time and the specific needs that this piece of machinery would have to fulfill. And, you know, they can't be accused of not taking tank design seriously because they're looking to the British who, you know, invented the thing. If anyone's going to know how to build them, it should obviously be the British, which I think your guest next week will.
Yeah, although ironically, Matthew, there's like a circular thing going on because kind of the British are looking at the French are kind of looking at the Russians look at the Germans look at the Americans. It's all kind of going, everyone's kind of waiting to see what other people are doing because there isn't this single idea about what the future of tanks are. Whereas by this point, there is beginning to be, in America at least, this idea, for example, of what strategic bombing can be coming. People are starting to kind of focus on one particular thing, and the Navy's kind of getting into its dive bombing and things. But with tanks, everyone's waiting. It's a bit of a who's on first. Everyone's waiting for someone else to make the. Oh, that's what we're doing with tanks, then, isn't it? Is that I'm kind of onto something there? I think, aren't I?
Yes, it's essentially exactly how it would come to play out for the next 15 years, honestly. And it's interesting that you bring up the idea that the Americans are starting to experiment with their strategic bombing. Air power was in addition to, and maybe a little bit more in this time period, something that the cavalry looked at as, you know, a major threat to their existence, because why do you need a guy on a horse to ride out 20 miles to see where the enemy is if you can send an airplane that can fly 100, 200 miles and see exactly not only where the enemy is, but where his supply trains are, where his rear echelon is located. So this is all playing into the United States cavalry kind of feeling like we don't have a purpose anymore, and we really got to justify that purpose. But let's get back to these tanks real quick. The 1921 and the 1922 they were just test bed vehicles. They never went into serious production. Only the 2 pilot tanks were built. They were used for a while, up until 1926, to test various components like new engines, different gun mounts, applique armor, this kind of thing. But as far as this design iteration goes, this is kind of it. But Christie's back on the scene. He shows back up in 1922 with his model 1921 fast convertible tank. And by fast, I mean fast. This thing could clock 40 miles an hour on his road wheels on a good road, which was unheard of for a big armored vehicle. So he won a contract to deliver a medium tank for testing, and he had done so, but at his own request, he figured he could build a better version of it. And so he withdrew the tank that had previously been accepted, the 1919, and then returned with this one in 1922. And as you can see, it's a little bit different. The turret's gone. All of the guns are now on the corners of the superstructure, which is a very interesting design choice. And it also meant that inside the fighting compartment, you are essentially sitting on each other's lap. There's supposed to be 4 guys in this thing. You just can't fight like that, and of course, you can see the 2 road wheels in the middle is replaced by a central pivot bogie. So despite Christie spending his own money to do this, the Army found that its mobility suffered when it was on tracks on rough country, and it was kind of too fast for its own good. You couldn't really steer it. The brake clutch steering system was famously unreliable, which meant that driving it at the speeds it was designed to drive was sort of quite dangerous. And it was also kind of, it was prone to mechanical breakdown. So the design, though it was accepted for testing, was rejected for standardization. And this was the 3rd time Christie had been rejected by the Ordnance Department. And this is the period in his life after he had failed to become a major player in the automotive world, because he thought his front-wheel drive automobile company was going to be the next big, Chrysler or Ford, which clearly it wasn't. And Christie was, described as being difficult and stubborn, and he was even accused of ignoring design requirements he disagreed with. So he's, not really great to work with. But we'll get back to Christie here in a little bit. What did the infantry think of tanks? They owned them, right? In 1922, they were just as confused as everyone else. They probably, though, they were the only branch that had a sober view. They already owned these tanks. They just had to figure out what to do with them. They weren't scared of what they might mean for their branch like the cavalry were. And they weren't sort of obsessing over the nuts and bolts the way the ordnance was. So they were just kind of trying to figure out their doctrine. They decided that tanks absolutely had to work with infantry. They didn't really know how a tank was going to break through enemy lines and attack their rear and move slow enough for the infantry to keep up, or how to get infantry to speed up. And there was some experiments with armored cars and carriers. But in this early in the game, it's not going anywhere. They did emphasize training with ground troops and tanks for cooperation, so that your average infantryman would know what to do if a tank was on the battlefield. Most infantry officers, according to their own writings in the Infantry Journal, they're more concerned with basic infantry tactics, with their personal equipment, with how tanks and infantry were going to cooperate together. But that's really low on their list. What was written about them was practical information. here the chief of the infantry notes that there are 4 new tank manuals, and I want to read them real quick because I think they're very telling. So you have 420-260 drill, heavy tank platoon and company. Keep in mind that the Army doesn't want a heavy tank; they want a medium tank. So good thing this manual is coming out. 420-265 tank ceremonies and inspections, very useful in the next war. 420-290 tanks, moves, and positions. There we go. Some practical, maybe even doctrinal leaning information. And then 420-295 tank supply, maintenance, and repair, which honestly is probably the most salient manual being released. Having worked on tanks for a little bit more than a decade, they don't go anywhere without a huge supply train feeding it. And even though later on cavalrymen are going to accuse tanks of consuming inordinate amounts of gasoline and oil, that's not necessarily true. They do take a lot, and it takes a lot of consumable stuff to keep them running, and then they break often. And it's just the nature of something being that heavy is it's just going to break. So you have to have spare parts, and you have to know how to fix that. And your infantrymen who are fighting the tank have to know how to fix it. If you're rolling on the battlefield and something breaks, you're not going to sit there and wait for the tow truck to show up, right? You've got to get out and you've got to, as we used to say, you got to fight the tank. So, it's clear the tanks are kind of a small part of the infantry world, and they were given the required amount of attention, but not really any more than that. The one exception is Colonel Rockenbach, who's the father of the tank corps. He directed the tank school at Fort Meade until 1924. And he was one of the leading voices in the early 1920s infantry journal discussing tanks, aside from a few other names that will pop up from time to time. Rockenbach probably felt like the unofficial spokesman of the tank force, and that it was his job to educate young infantry officers about just what tanks were supposed to do. Not that he or anyone else in the Army at this point really had a clear idea of what that was. From 1923 to 1926, mercifully, not much is happening in regards to tank design, tank doctrine, the argument with the cavalry. But here's that slide with Rockenbach. I'll leave that up here for a second. People can read. It says tanks constitute a valuable weapon against enemy tanks, and tank action, speed, and power to maneuver quickly are especially important. And that's
almost saying what I was saying earlier. Is it a valuable weapon against enemy? We need to know what the enemy have so that we can counter it with our whatever it is we're calling a tank. It's only going to be clarified by what the enemy call a tank, because at this point, with the designs you've shown us, there isn't even a clear idea among the military about what even a tank looks like. Whereas, today in 2025, we could say to a kid, draw us a tank, and a 10-year-old kid could draw a tank that would look more or less like any tank. But back then, a tank is whatever a prototype designer wants it to be: a long, thin thing, a short, fast thing, suspension, no suspension, turret or not a turret, gun platform. Or there is no agreed idea about what even a tank is.
You're so right, Paul. And that's not before we even get to the discussion of nomenclature and terminology. I could set the chat on fire, I'm sure, by trying to define what a tank is, especially.
Well, we tried with Tank Destroyer a year and a half ago, and at the end of the week, we were further away from clarifying what a tank destroyer was than when we started. It depends on doctrine, use, description, language, nationality, etc., etc. And the same thing with tank. When does it? Anyway, we're going down a rabbit hole of when does an armored car become a tank? When does a self-propelled gun become a tank? And let's not go down that one, otherwise we'll never get out of it.
Oh yeah, no, exactly. We're moving forward. The designers are trying to, kind of feel around for the outlines of what a tank is, but they kind of need a doctrine in place so that they can design a machine that will fit that doctrine. But it's hard.
What do you want us to create a tank for? because then maybe we can actually try and fulfill that for you. But yeah, it's
Exactly.
the head wagging the tail wagging the dog in a sense.
And there aren't really any tanks that can do the things that would create the doctrine, and we're going to get into those failures here in a little bit. In 1927, the Army found enough wiggle room in the budget to forward 2 tank designs to initial production. The first one being the light tank T1, small 2-man crew, had a driver and a commander, and the commander was also the loader, and he was also the gunner. This is going to teach some very important lessons on task saturation and just how much one man can be responsible for in combat. It had a rear-mounted turret with the engine in the front. Now, the ordnance thought this helped with engine cooling. The operators hated it because all of that heat blew directly into the fighting compartment. And this is another one of those lessons where you kind of have the engineer going, this is the best way to build a tank. And you have the operator saying, if we can't fight in it comfortably, it's not a good design. It's armed with the same 37 millimeter short cannon as before. Another Browning 30 cal coaxially mounted. It was pretty fast though. It had a top speed of 20 miles an hour. But as you can see, again, it's completely unsprung. So it's going to be a very bumpy 20 miles an hour. And it's light. It only weighed 7.5 tons. The other tank design forwarded was another medium tank. This is the medium T1, which is a direct lineage from the M1921 Phase 2, which included redesigned components. It had a new Packard engine, which gave it a little bit more power. The first prototype that was completed was just built with mild steel because it saved the Army like $15,000 instead of using the face hardened steel. And it was pretty successful in testing. And then it was recommended for standardization in 1928 as medium tank M1, but this was going to be withdrawn a year later. So don't get cozy. Tank development sort of catches a break here with regards to what we were talking about as far as trying to figure out some doctrine. But it's also the first sign of doom for the cavalry. Secretary of War Dwight Davis observed the British experimental mechanized force and was impressed. So he ordered Charles Summerall, the chief of staff, to organize a mechanized force of his own. This directive was executed by General Parker. Remember his name. And the experimental mechanized force was constituted on the 1st of July in 1928, commanded by Colonel Adna Chaffee, who also remember his name. He's the namesake of the much, much later light tank M24, and he's the future commander of the 7th Mechanized Brigade. So he's going to play a pretty big role in armor into the Second World War. And I'm sure you know all about him. So this force was mostly comprised of all of those old, obsolete light tanks and heavy tanks, and then a bunch of old and worn out trucks. There was only one platoon that had the new light tank. And that new light tank was this. This is the T1E1, which is anatomically the same as the T1. Although you can see a redesigned fighting compartment superstructure, minor component upgrades. And this was also briefly standardized as the light tank M1, which was later rescinded. And, only 4 were built. And those happened to be with the experimental mechanized force. So they're going through their maneuvers. They're trying to invent doctrine with equipment that can't keep up with what they're expecting these vehicles to do, especially if they're going to be doing the same kind of big sweeping maneuvers that we saw the British mechanized forces doing over in the UK. But these tanks just couldn't do it, which is going to become a problem. The next year, we see the light tank T1E2. This slide is a picture of the T1E1 in the Ordnance Journal. I just wanted to throw that up there. So the T1E2 is further prototyping of the light tank T1. It's got a little bit thicker armor, higher velocity, 37 millimeter gun. It's got a new turret design. It's also got a hefty weight increase. It's now nearly 9 tons, and a bit of a drop in speed to correspond with that armor, but all in all, sort of a fair trade-off. So let's talk about the Ordnance real quick, because they're doing a lot of writing about tank development around this time. They dutifully reported on all of these developments. Writers like C.C. Benson and J.K. Christmas become regular voices on the subject. They're highly interested in tanks because they were the ones designing them. And they had a fairly balanced view. Like I said, they were more interested in the nuts and bolts of how mechanization would work, nuts and bolts of the actual machine, and how are we going to build a fighting force around these. And this is opposed to the cavalry, who were interested in remaining an independent force of quick maneuver, and the infantry, who were interested in how tanks could be used as an auxiliary to support their own attacks. And like most engineers I know, they were interested in building the best product to fit the design criteria. Recall Robert Ix from earlier. But as we keep saying, no one knows what the design criteria is really supposed to fulfill other than be fast, be maneuverable, go over bad terrain. But one thing they were interested in is what foreign armies were getting up to. And this is exactly what you were talking about, Paul. They wanted to see how other nations were mechanizing their own armies. And they wanted to weigh the pros and cons and the benefits of how those nations were doing it. If the future was a mechanized and motorized army, the Ordnance Department wanted to be as up-to-date as possible about those current trends. Here they're talking about how the British are mechanizing their armored forces. We're going to get into JFC Fuller here in a second. It's kind of a wild ride, so a little bit of foreshadowing. But this writing about tanks wasn't confined to just military journals. The newspapers reported on tanks near constantly from 1918 all the way up until 1941, and I mean through the Second World War. But that entire interwar period, the newspapers were fascinated with tanks. They couldn't get enough of them. If you have a subscription to like the New York Times, you can go on their Times Machine portal, just search tank 1918 to 1940, and just see the pages and pages and pages of articles that are written about it. Sometimes they're just reprinting press releases. Sometimes it's retired military officers throwing in their opinion. Sometimes it's reporting on a tank trial that the press was invited to.
But this sort of stuff is that, I mean, it's like in France, all the scientific journals and even comics for kids were talking about the Maginot Line the same time. This is the era in that wake of the First World War and trench warfare, and let's not do this again, where in a broad sense, science was predicted to be the answer, but only as just it'll be science that solves it, not in a specific doctrinal way, but like technology will come into everybody's solution. And this is the kind of beginning of all the science fiction fascination and the kind of Flash Gordon, all that kind of stuff. And it came up in the sidebar about that kind of thing. So as interesting as these articles and things are that you're talking about, it's a sign of the era, as well as actually a kind of directional aid telling us what's happening with the military design.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit it on the head. The other thing that these newspapers sort of were responsible for is, a newspaper editor knows a good conflict when they see it. And what we see a lot of in these newspaper articles from this time period specifically is that sort of back and forth between, is the cavalry going to mechanize or are they not? Should the horse remain the mounted cavalrymen's primary mode of transportation, or are we going to meet the future? And I mean, they're really going to pick up on that in the 1930s, but right now it's sort of, the public imagination has been captured by the tank. So, as the cavalry begins to get more concerned with the idea of mechanization, sorry, my screen froze for a second.
I'm still here.
Okay, cool, excellent. Yeah, the cavalry gets more concerned with the idea of a mechanized cavalry force that is dependent entirely on armored cars and tanks. And there's a lot of friction happening at the upper echelons between the chief of cavalry and the brigade and battalion commanders about the extent and the usefulness of this mechanization. The people who were kind of seen as desperately clinging to the saddle became known as the horsey set, which is an obvious pejorative meant to infantilize the proponents of horse cavalry. And I just want to be totally fair. Yes, they were clinging to their horses in the face of what was obviously the inexorable march towards modernization. But as we can see by the designs that are being offered by the Ordnance Department, the horse is still the mode of transportation for the job. Patton reappears with C.C. Benson from the Ordnance Department to talk about how tanks are hyper useful as support roles for certain cavalry missions in certain circumstances on certain terrain close to a railhead. And so I wanted to bring this up here to kind of iterate that the cavalry aren't they're not a monolith. There's a lot of different people and they all have their own ideas, and some voices get elevated higher than others. But there is a genuine discourse going on within the cavalry about, what are they going to do with this mechanization problem? In 1920, the Cavalry Journal, the Cavalry Journal articles mention tanks 12 times for the whole year. By 1929, they're mentioned 149 times. This is really interesting because at the time, there are only 24 light tanks in the entire cavalry as of 1928. And these are a combination of the M1917s and the T1E ones. But the cavalry did have a cause for all the concern. Chaffee, who is now a member of the War Department's Mechanization Board, proposed a mechanized force to be outfitted with modern equipment as a, quote, highly mobile, self-contained offensive unit that operated independently at the Army Corps, at the Corps and Army level. This was supposed to be comprised of 2,000 men, included a light tank battalion, 2 infantry battalions carried by tracked vehicles, and a built-in logistics train. It was a sure bet, and they asked the Army for an additional $1 million to acquire the new equipment. But unfortunately, the budgetary plan for the fiscal year 1930 had already been submitted. And by the way, the stock market crashed. So the Ordnance Department seriously considered mechanization in foreign armies. They were still highly interested in what other countries were doing, especially in the face of a global depression. And this is what they found, that European units, specifically the British, were making self-contained, highly mobile, armed to the teeth units to make big sweeping maneuvers independent of a main body force, which is exactly what Chaffee had asked for. But there's also publications by British tank experts like JFC Fuller and BH Liddell Hart. And I want to talk about Fuller real quick. So he became kind of this preeminent tank historian and mechanization champion after the First World War. But he had some fairly strange ideas about politics. And in fact, he became a member of Britain's Union of Fascists. So yeah, not a swell guy. He also had a very interesting relationship with Aleister Crowley, the kind of occultic, mystical personality. And he wrote poetry with him and even joined his esoteric group, the AA. Liddell Hart was no angel either, for a different reason. He was a Rommel fanboy. And so he edited Rommel's posthumous memoirs, and he made sure that Rommel mentioned him by name and how much he was inspired by Liddell Hart's work. And I mean, you can't put all the blame on Liddell Hart. British propaganda post-war was doing a lot to elevate Rommel's tactical genius to kind of explain some of the British shortcomings in the desert. And Liddell Hart's portrayal of Rommel as a good Nazi fit square within that theme. But that was influential in propagating the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. We know is absolutely a myth. But these were the guys who were some of the loudest voices in British mechanization. So 1930 rolls around. The mechanized force gets reduced in size and stature, and they're slashed from 2,000 soldiers just down to 550. There's one light tank company, a machine gun company, an armored car troop, and the logistics and support. Meanwhile, the development of the T1 continued with the light tank T1E3. It's a combination of new components from both the T1E1 and the T1E2. Featuring a new sprung suspension. So it's got a nice smooth ride, and as a result, it's got a higher top speed, 21 miles an hour. The Army also introduces the T2. This is their new medium tank. And just real quick, are we seeing some similarities? It's basically an enlarged light tank T1. It's got a 47 millimeter gun and a Browning 50 cal coaxially mounted. And it bears not only a striking resemblance to the T1, but to the British Vickers medium for a reason. Again, the U.S. tank designers, specifically in the Ordnance Department, are trying to figure out what works best. And there's this idea in biology, carcinization, and it's where crustaceans, ocean-going crustaceans, tend to evolve into the crab shape because perhaps the crab shape is the best shape evolutionarily speaking. And if you apply that to tanks for a second, there is sort of this ebb and flow where at certain times tank design all tends to go along in one basic trajectory before, branching out and new experiments are tried, and then it will come together again. Like right now, if you look at any main battle tank, the M1 Abrams, the Leopard 2, the Korea's K2, they all share the same basic plan because that works, and it works the best. So the Ordnance Department was doing the same thing back in the 1930s. They were trying to look to see what worked best, and the British medium Mark E was pretty good. Or not the Mark E, excuse me. I'm going to get lit up for that. Just the British Vickers medium. The Mark E will come here in a second. So 1931, MacArthur, now Chief of Staff, reorganizes the mechanized force into the cavalry's historic 1st Cavalry Regiment. So he argues that modern firearms effectively rendered horse soldiers obsolete. This does not go over well for the cavalry. He concedes that horses supported by motorized elements could possibly be of some use, and reiterates that the whole force should be mechanized to keep abreast of modern styles of warfare. The Chief of Infantry, Stephen Fuqua, who also remember his name, objected loudly, stating that the cavalry's acceptance of motors would prove that the cavalry was strategically unnecessary. And if the cavalry were mounted on motorized vehicles, armored cars, and tanks, then they might as well be the infantry, which is interesting coming from Fuqua, who was an infantry officer. But there's more developments. Christie's back with his medium T3. And he had been reworking this, the 1921 model into the M1928, which was tested at Aberdeen and showed a lot of promise. It had a fast, smooth ride, thanks to now independently sprung road wheels. And during a November 1928 test, it made 28 miles an hour from Fort Meade to Gettysburg. This thing received a ton of media publicity, which, of course, Christie loved. Predominantly because his company, the Front Drive Motor Company, had just been rebranded into the U.S. Wheel Track Layer Corporation, signaling that he meant to win the contract for the Army's medium tank and that it was going to be his company's sole effort. His 1928 model was eventually accepted, but Christie was, not easy to get along with. And after several rounds of protracted negotiations, which lasted until January of 1931, the Army agreed to buy his tanks, well, they bought 7 of them. They were referred to as the M1931 and officially designated as medium tank T3. 3 of these T3s were sent to the infantry at Benning, which is now Fort Moore, and 4 were sent to the cavalry at Knox. These were redesignated for the cavalry as Combat Car T1 because the National Defense Act of 1920 said the infantry owns tanks. The cavalry can't have them. So how do you get around that? You don't call it a tank. Still a tank, maybe. But they're simultaneously working on another design based on the Christie suspension and the convertible nature of the tracks. This is because Christie spent an extended amount of time redesigning his vehicle and the time spent negotiating. So the Army wanted, or the cavalry specifically wanted something like Christie's design, but they wanted it cheaper, and they developed this. It's got the convertible track idea, so you can run it as a half track, you can run it as a full track, you can run it as no track. This was the Combat Car T2, which was very briefly designated Combat Car T5, but this is confusing enough as it is, and there's a later Combat Car T5, and I don't want anyone to get smoke coming out of their ears trying to keep up with all these designations. The important thing is that this design had no future with the cavalry, as they had already asked the Ordnance Department in 1932 to design a cavalry-specific vehicle. Meanwhile, the T1 program is still chugging along. In 1931, about summertime, they received a Vickers Mark E, and they tested it, and they really liked it. The Mark E was designed for export, and its one-size-fits-all design philosophy was highly suited for foreign nations to purchase and then outfit to their own specific needs. This is the same tank that would go on to become the T-26. One of Japan's light tanks was influenced by this. It was shipped all over. Everyone had their hands on one. Everyone was looking at it. But the Ordnance Department trialed it against the T1 series light tank, and the Mark E performs much better. Its rear-mounted engine and its bogie-mounted suspension gave it better balance, a better ride. Its exhaust wasn't choking the driver as he was trying to negotiate the obstacle course. So they decided to implement the best parts of the Mark E into the T1 program. So that became the T1E4, which was accepted for testing in March of 32. And it performs satisfactorily. Not as well as the Mark E, but better than the other iterations of the T1. Its main problems was that it was heavier and slower. And because of that, the T1 program was shut down in 1934. But that's okay. A completely new design was already in the works. Also around this time, Chief of Cavalry Guy V. Henry was busy reassuring the so-called horsey set that any mechanization during this time was merely an experiment, and the final decision would come down to how well the motor set performed, how much money was allocated to the endeavor, and any future developments in geopolitics. Basically just trying to keep the cavalrymen from losing their minds with anxiety. He wanted to keep the cavalry together as best as he could. Some were already, of the cavalry, were already saying the cavalry doesn't need to exist anymore and we should have our own force as an armored force. But Henry understood somewhat prophetically that if the cavalry did split between a true mechanized side and a pure horse side, that eventually this administrative split would become a true split, and that would weaken the cavalry overall. We also kind of see a change in the mindset in the way that these cavalry officers are writing about the mechanization process. Mechanization, they claim, didn't have to be the death of mounted thinking or tradition. Spit-polished boots, riding breeches, horse vocabulary, tactical appraisal, all of these things could continue to be used within a mechanical force. And that's true because the modern U.S. cavalry still uses all of those terms. If you see them with their Stetsons and their spurs and sabers rattling around. So this is the very beginning of what we see is kind of cavalrymen beginning to see the writing on the wall that this march of futuristic mechanization is going to happen. Meanwhile, The medium T3 was continuing its trials. This is the T3E2, a little bit of a modification. Highly mobile. Its armor was, though, insufficient for a medium tank. Again, its fighting compartment was too cramped. The Ordnance Department laid down a redesign, but even though the vehicle was a little bit wider, and it had a bow-mounted 30 cal, which is going to become a mainstay of U.S. tank design, it was still unsuccessful. It was still not as mobile as they wanted it to be, wasn't as armored as they wanted it to be. And of course, looking across the pond, there are better ways to design tanks. At the same time, the mechanized set was moving to their new home at Fort Knox. The horse cavalry at Fort Riley were also experimenting with trucks and trailers to haul their horses over long distances. This was tested with the 1st Squadron of the 7th Cav, which started at Fort Bliss and known as the Big Ben Portee. They traveled 616 miles in 10 days, which is really good. The horses arrived ready to continue operations. The personnel arrived ready to continue operations. The trucks were fairly reliable. This article, which covers the exercise in the November-December 1933 issue of the Ordnance Journal, was written by Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a Massachusetts senator. And Lodge resigned from politics to serve in the Second World War as a tank platoon commander. And then later, when he was back in the Senate, he was instrumental in convincing Republican senators to vote for the Marshall Plan. I love it when characters in the story come together. But what the experiment showed is that the so-called horsey set, they weren't against some forms of mechanization. You know, they weren't all reactionaries who were entirely resistant whatsoever to change, though those types did exist. Instead, most of them were just true believers that only horses were fit to do the job that was being asked of the cavalry. And they were willing to try new technologies as they became available and proved reliable. Further development on the Christie design continued into 1935. This is the medium tank T4. By this point, Christie's out of the picture, to put it bluntly. The issues with program cost, personality clashes, and the Ordnance Department doubted that Christie's U.S. Wheel and Track Layer Corporation could even produce the number of vehicles required. The contract for production instead went to his direct competitor, America La France, which I'm sure he was pretty steamed about. The combat car T4 was ultimately fairly successful with high mobility, but it was still expensive, still heavy, and as another project reached maturation, increasingly obsolete. That project was the light tank T2. Its ultimate form showed enough promise that the Ordnance Department continued plans for an improved light tank independent of Christie's designs. With the combat car T4 being unsuccessful, plans for a light, fast tank were created by Harry Knox, who had worked on developing the T1 series. The design was trialed, and light tank T2 was accepted for standardization. This is also where we begin to see the first signs of what would eventually become a recognizable Second World War tank.
Yeah.
The T2 used the same British-style bogies, which were eventually deemed less desirable than the new vertical volute suspension that was going to be employed on the combat car T5. A light tank T2E1 with this style suspension was introduced and then would continue development. The T2 was cheap, it was fast, moderately well protected. It could provide adequate firepower. It had 2 machine guns in the turret and 1 in the bow. And it was developed simultaneously with the cavalry's design, the T5, which is this. The major difference here is the replacement of the British-style bogie with that vertical volute suspension. This would remain on American light and medium tanks throughout most of the Second World War, only being ditched on the medium tank M4 with the horizontal volute suspension system, and then, of course, the torsion bar systems that came on some of the tank destroyers and heavy tanks. Unfortunately, the cavalry was still stuck on this idea of a twin turret, an idea that was already dropped by British designs. And it would also invoke a lambasting by a certain German tank expert in the coming years. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1934, the Army and the cavalry sought to test both the motorized horse cavalry and the idea of a mechanized cavalry. And despite any resistance by the horsey set, the higher echelons at this point had decided to toe the Army's line with regards to modernization. The chief of cavalry told all his formations, we, the cavalry, are going to push the development of our mechanized cavalry to the limit of appropriations and ingenuity in order to find out its powers and limitations and to fit it into its appropriate place in this team. These exercises demonstrated that the mechanized forces could keep up with and prevail against the horse cavalry while meeting objectives with rapidity. The official report notes that they routinely outmaneuvered non-mechanized elements, though the horse cavalry had them beat in night attacks, in stream and river crossings, and they could deny important bridges that the mechanized forces would need to cross. The maneuvers were a good showing of the mechanized cavalry's potential, but the mechanized force was still crippled by a lack of genuine tanks. Only 4 of the supposed 24 combat cars assigned to the regiment even existed, and the rest were just trucks. And they neither had the speed, mobility, or psychological effect of an actual tank. We get into 1935 with the medium T4. This is the final development of the Christie type medium tank. Despite having worked out most of the kinks of Christie's design, the tank was still judged too heavy, not well enough protected, too expensive. It would continue to be trialed and then was recommended for standardization, but the bid was rejected for the above reasons. However, there's a caveat. In the late 1930s, as a European war became more and more likely, it was decided by the War Department that the medium tank you have is better than a potential better medium tank you don't have. And so it was recommended for standardization in early in 1939. They built 18 of them. They went to Fort Benning, and then by 1940, they were deemed obsolete and retired. And that ends the story of the Christie tank in the U.S. But Christie, probably bristling at his treatment from the Ordnance Department and also facing imminent bankruptcy, covertly sold his tank designs to the Soviets, and he shipped it overseas with the label farm equipment. And thus, the Soviets used it to build their BT series of light fast tanks, as well as the storied T-34 tank. But coming back to the United States, we get in 1935 the standardized version of the T5 combat car. This is the combat car M1. And as we can see, finally some sense is prevailing. The cavalry ditched the twin turrets for the standardization. The combat car M1 was the final version. It was the tank that the cavalry was going to continue to carry with them until well into the late 30s and into 1940. It was quick, highly mobile, had good endurance, mechanically reliable, and it was heavily armed. And I'm going to digress a little bit to talk about this. The American cavalry at this point were fascinated by the 50 cal machine gun. They thought that it was powerful enough to defeat any tank that they may encounter. And it was almost true. In modern times, the 50 cal is so ubiquitous and the armor is so modern that you can fire an entire belt of 50 cal at a modern armored vehicle and not do a whole lot. In 1935, a half-inch projectile fired from a machine gun was devastating. And the cavalry loved it. They loved it so much that each horse squadron was assigned 8 of them to be carried on horseback. What they would do is send these machine gun horses to the front, dismount the machine guns, and create a screen against attacking forces, thinking that if there was a column of tanks rolling up, you could just light them up with 8 50 caliber machine guns. It was a good idea, but developments in the rest of the world are going to prove that that is not going to work. On the infantry side, we get the light tank M2A1. This is the combat car M1's twin sister. This was the culmination of the light tank T2E1 design lineage with the vertical volute suspension and outwardly very similar to the M1 combat car. The only difference is the turret, which mounted a single machine gun instead of the cavalry's dual mount. In 1936, this is again redeveloped into the M2A2, but it's not an improvement, right? It's important to talk about this within Army designations and nomenclature. Because something is an A1 and an A2 doesn't mean A1 is worse and the A2 is the better version. It's just the next number in the nomenclature. So if two designs are being produced at the same time and one gets standardized first, it'll get the A1. And the follow-on one, even though it may be a worse product, may get the A2. So to end any confusion with that. But it still had, obviously, this twin turret issue. And while clumsy and, it's kind of dorky looking, obviously they're going to get in each other's way. There was a very simple reason why the infantry wanted twin turrets. Running the length of this vehicle was a drive shaft, and it was massive. And a single turret required the person operating the turret to straddle this thing while trying to maneuver the turret around. And it was a recipe for disaster. So 2 turrets, 2 operators, each on one side of the drivetrain seemed to solve that problem. The drivetrain problem would get solved fairly soon, so don't worry. But it did evoke some strong criticism. In November of 1936, the New York Times published a scathing review from a German tank expert named Heinz Bach. Bach goes on to talk about how the U.S. appeared to be actively attempting to make all the same mistakes as European tank designers, which is really funny because the United States was looking at the Europeans and trying to mimic their design criteria. But specifically, it calls out the T5 with its twin turrets. It disparages the old T1 series of prototypes and even comments on the medium T1 from the 1920s. The next day, a statement from the Army refuted this critique. They said that Heinz Bach was misinformed and that they acknowledged that the old style prototypes and the obsolete First World War tanks were still technically in the Army's inventory, but they weren't being used. They were in storage. The thing is interesting is that it does refute that the T5 has 2 turrets when it absolutely did. But anyway, by late 1936, the combat car M1 and light tank M2 were the only 2 standardized tanks in the Army, and only the M2 had the twin turrets. So somebody is misinformed, or someone is trying to cover up for international kind of pantsing situation. But it does speak on a larger sort of topic that there's a media frenzy kind of going on, specifically in the mid-1930s, about American tanks and their efficacy. General Parker, remember him, wrote an article that essentially says that, of course, Americans can't build tanks. Americans should have horses. Why even try to build tanks? It's a worthless endeavor. Horse. But I also want to talk about Heinz Bach. I have trolled the archives looking for that issue of the Militär Wochenblatt, which is the German weekly publication that this article was initially published in. I can't find it. I have no record of any Heinz Bach serving in any German tank formations whatsoever. So Nicholas Moran, the chieftain, has said that Heinz Guderian visited Fort Knox in 1936, but in Guderian's own memoirs, he doesn't mention this, and I can't find any primary records. So if that is the case, I would love to see it. I just can't find it. Make that what you will with Heinz Bach. But regardless of whether or not Guderian himself made it to Fort Knox, his writing certainly did. In the September and December issues of the Cavalry Journal, Guderian published a 2-part featurette titled Armored Forces, which is essentially a condensed version of his now famous book, Achtung Panzer. It should be made clear that Guderian worked on German armor doctrine, but it was not the sole author of it. It should also be clear that German armor doctrine was not a secret, right? Blitzkrieg wasn't like a super secret top, didn't surprise the world with their tank tactics, specifically because these military leaders were constantly talking to each other and constantly observing each other's formations, and they were writing prolifically about their ideas. The upshot here is every nation, even knowing another nation's doctrine, tries to design a doctrine and a force that is bespoke to their own specific needs. While, of course, taking what information they can from observation. And speaking of observation, around this time, the Spanish Civil War kicks off. It was followed closely by American military observers, and head of these observers, reporting directly back to the Secretary of War, was Stephen Fuqua. Remember him? His conclusions, sort of a no-brainer, is that tanks were of limited use. He thought that they could achieve their objectives best when operated in coordination with infantry and when operated in mass. He noted that in several engagements of the Republicans against the German Condor Legion, that single tanks here and there were usually knocked out by anti-tank guns, and that they were most successful when there was a large amount of them all moving in tandem. But he also spoke about the absolute need for anti-tank guns, that the best anti-tank weapon was an anti-tank gun. But curiously, he wrote the best anti-tank weapon was a tank. Say that 5 times fast. He said that tanks needed heavier armor and bigger guns to be effective. And this is truly because the Soviet T-26, which I had mentioned earlier, had a true gun. And the German and Italian tanks that were being used at the time by the Franciscans were using machine guns. And so it was, if there was one or two of these small machine gun armed tanks out in the open, they were easy pickings for a bigger tank. And the smaller machine gun tanks couldn't really defeat a tank that was armored against machine guns. So a gun was paramount. So the results are in from true combat on the modern stage. Bigger, heavier armored tanks with bigger guns. Sounds like the Army needs a solid medium tank. Good thing they had spent the last 2 decades perfecting their medium tank. That's right. They had canceled it, right? So enter medium tank T5, armed with the knowledge of the observation from the Spanish Civil War. The Ordnance Department recommended a medium tank. And technically, this recommendation came in the first months of 1936. But as 1937 rolled in and these observations started hitting the War Department's desk, there was an increased emphasis on getting this thing done. The T5 was meant to be a heavily armed and armored medium tank, which would satisfy all of the battlefield requirements observed by Fuqua. And looking at it, it's essentially an enlarged light tank M2. It's got some key differences, though. It was armed with the long high-velocity 37mm anti-tank gun, meaning it was intended, in line with Fuqua's reports, to fight any tanks it encountered. It had a twin machine gun barbettes in the corners, and you can, if you look at the picture here, each of those 4 corners has a machine gun in a traversing mount. This is in addition to the 2 forward-facing machine guns that were static. They were locked in place. So it's safe to say that the U.S.
It's back to the tank designs of the First World War in many ways.
Yeah, they're still firmly in the grip of the cult of the machine gun at this point, and they would continue to be well into the 1940s. I mean, I think the medium tank M4 finally gives up the ghost on the forward-facing machine guns in late 41, early 42. So, Army Chief of Staff Malin Craig, hearing recommendations from the chiefs of cavalry and the operations section, created a full-on mechanized cavalry division in April of 38. This seems like the cavalry are finally entering into a stage where they're going to accept that eventual full mechanization, but it really couldn't be farther from reality. What was wanted by upper-level leaders was a separate mechanized branch that would assume the applicable missions from both the cavalry and the infantry. although some leaders thought that the required legislation that would authorize a new branch would display an implied divisiveness within the Army. But there was a divide. And in fact, one Lieutenant Colonel Chapman published a white paper calling for the creation of a mechanized branch, and further, that the cavalry should be reduced in size and relegated to reconnaissance and security missions. The chief of cavalry at the time berated Chapman for releasing this paper into the wild without consulting him first, because it was putting kind of all the dirty laundry on display. In 1939, we get John K. Hare as the chief of cavalry. And he is described sometimes as like adamantly of the horsey set, and that's not really accurate. He just didn't want to see a reduction in the cavalry, especially a reduction in the horse cavalry. He was all about increasing mechanization, as long as it didn't infringe on the horsey set. As the year wore on, though, the option to increase the size of the cavalry and therefore its role in main battle with more of a mechanized component was proposed. And it put the horse set in kind of a bind. They could either support a more prominent role in the war that was likely coming, or they could deny mechanization and then relegate themselves to a faded, forgotten arm. But in the end, this choice was made for them. Meanwhile, the T5 Phase 3 is standardized as the medium tank M2. In 1939, they built 18 of them. Visually very similar with the T5, but it had slightly longer hull, had thicker armor, and a brand new engine. This vehicle would receive an upgrade as the medium tank M2A1 with a little bit more armor, a little bit more of a roomier turret, but production was halted as reports from the war in Europe indicated that its armor and gun were already obsolete. During this time, even as the production contract for the medium M2 was being canceled, the War Department was alerting the locomotive firms and America's enormous automotive industry that they're going to have to either convert your existing facilities or build new ones to cope with the amount of tanks that are going to be necessary for this coming war. And to their credit, those firms said, Roger that. And, they did just that. At the dawn of the 1940s, we see cavalrymen still trying to come to grips with the dual identities of a motorized horse-mounted strike element and a mechanized formation. Articles like this appear in the Cavalry Journal all the way to the end of the 1940s, truly, or 1940, excuse me. But this rhetoric was the horsey set's agonal breathing. The Third Army did the Louisiana maneuvers that year, and it was really the final nail in the coffin for the cavalry guys. Support for full mechanization coalesced as mechanical forces overwhelmed horse cavalry at nearly every turn. In fact, Third Army Commander Lieutenant General Stanley Embick recommended transformation from more horse cavalry into mechanized, and then retaining the horses only for sporadic reconnaissance. Chief of Staff Craig called a meeting with the senior tank formation commanders to assess the possibility of creating a new branch in May of that year. Now, this was a secret meeting done in a basement, and interesting to note, the chiefs of the armor and the infantry were not in attendance. So take what you will from the fact that the decision of what's going to happen to your branch is happening out from under you. It was agreed that tanks from that point forward would be a separate force under the label of armor, a move which historian Vincent Tedesco described as, quote, getting away from the infantry and cavalry terminology and to bypass the wording of the National Defense Act of 1920, end quote. Essentially, it spelled the cavalry's doom as an independent branch. Their worst fears had come to fruition. They were relegated to the reconnaissance and security missions of their nightmares and drastically reduced in size and in importance. The chief of staff did not bother to replace the chief of cavalry once John K. Hare left the office in 1942. So why were the cavalrymen against something that seemed so inevitable? Sarah Mazza and Robert Nye, two cultural historians, write about how when people are faced with the destruction of their identity, they tend to look backwards as a way of reimagining themselves in the present and in the future. Tanks and mechanization generally threatened cavalrymen whose identity was wrapped up in being a fast-moving, mounted shock and reconnaissance troop. Tanks, in the minds of the most adamant cavalry officers, could not do what horses could do, and their adoption would have destroyed the self-identity of an entire branch of soldiers. That armored vehicle technology matured significantly in the past 20 years didn't seem to matter very much. In response to this threat, the most gung-ho of the horse, he said, clung to their saddles in a desperate attempt to retain that sense of identity. As mechanization became apparent, they had no choice but to reassess that identity and their place in the modern military. Mobile combat power, not the horse, became the internal identity for cavalrymen. The mechanized cavalryman went from being a wild-eyed dreamer in a tin can that proper cavalry snuffed at, to being a mounted armored knight on steel steeds. This shift in mindset, unfortunately, occurred too late to save the branch. Of course, cavalrymen are not a monolith, as I had said earlier. And even though the discourse around mechanization was generally limited to for or against, there was a broader spectrum of feeling on the topic. As Tedesco points out, there are four main categories of cavalrymen in the 30s. The reactionaries, who didn't want mechanization at all. The conservatives, who believed mechanization of some cavalry for certain missions was acceptable and even desirable. The progressives, who believed that mechanization was the future and they wanted to hurry the process along. And the radicals, who wanted to shut down the horse cavalry for good and face modern warfare in a mechanized force. The stubborn horse-mounted cavalryman with his traditions and esprit de corps, charging anachronistically with his saber at tank columns, is more of a public press invention. For instance, the Polish cavalry charging Nazi tanks myth was first written about in the New York Times and has been promulgated ever since. That did not happen, right? I just want to make it clear, no one is dumb enough to charge an armored formation on a horse with a saber. It did not happen. The United States Army would be mechanized, though, and this was apparent as early as 1928. The harder the cavalrymen fought to cling to their stirrups and saddles, the more they began to actually fit that stereotype. But let's get back to the tanks real quick. The M2A2 was further developed into the M2A4, which is now beginning to look reasonably like what we would take to war. This would get developed further into the light tank M3 and then the light tank M5. The medium tank M3 came about as a stopgap measure while the Ordnance Department worked on a true medium tank, which would become the medium M4. This design was accepted for standardization in under a month from laying down the initial design criteria. They accepted it before they had a working prototype. That's the kind of rush that we're talking about here. And of course, that was developed into the medium tank M4. By 1943, the Cavalry Journal had ceased writing about horses entirely. The U.S. didn't send horse cavalry units to theaters in the Second World War. They sent cavalry elements as mechanized reconnaissance or as dismounted troops. But for the mounted horse soldier, it was all over.
Well, brilliant stuff, Matthew. Tour de force. We've got a few questions and comments and things that have been building up, so we'll deal with them. Firstly, a couple of compliments. Dr. Philip Blood is saying this is too interesting, the best talk this year. I think a representative one is about the doctrine. And Dennis, this is an earlier question from sort of half an hour ago, but it kind of feels relevant for the end of it. So Dennis said, had they settled on a doctrine at this point in the 1930s, were these tanks meant to fight enemy infantry and or horse cavalry, defeat other tanks? Reconnaissance still seems a bit scattered. But it seems to me, Matthew, that the answer, the US Army in the end, sort of didn't have to make that decision because they sort of left it so late that by the time they're having to make the decision, the war is underway. The type of warfare they're going to be engaged in has occurred, and so they're now reacting rather than predicting. Is that a sort of a simplistic way of describing it?
Absolutely. So the field manual that the Army took with them into combat, first in North Africa and then into Italy, and then
blank, and they had to fill it in when they got there.
FM 100-5 that was written after the Louisiana maneuvers in 1940, and so a genuine like bulletproof airtight doctrine didn't exist. For instance, the tank destroyers didn't exist. So no one had any clue. They were figuring that out day by day. But as far as the 1930s go, the doctrine that was kind of being facilitated at this point was that the tanks with the infantry were going to hammer those hard points, those bunkers, machine gun nests, fortifications. They were going to look for and exploit lines, or weaknesses in the lines that the infantry would then rush in behind and sort of mop up. The cavalry were supposed to use their fast combat cars to do sort of what horse cavalry did in the last century, make these big sweeping flanking maneuvers around enemy formations, destroy the rear, harry their rear echelon troops. That was the idea. But like I said, the problem was that they didn't have a tank that could do that on either side. They didn't have a good medium tank. They didn't have a good light tank. So this doctrine was all theoretical, you know?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. We had a question, a really good one, early one from Trent Telenko. When did the U.S. Army add transmitting and receiving radios to all of its tanks? And when Guderian comes up, the wise heads always say, well, it was his understanding of signals and communication that made him a better proponent of tank warfare than understanding armor per se. So when did the U.S. Well, there's the question: when did the U.S. add radios?
The U.S. had been experimenting with wireless sets fairly early. The problem was that we didn't have very good ones. When did the U.S. start putting radios in tanks as a standard piece of equipment is embarrassingly late. There's plenty of units that showed up to their theater of combat without a radio, and these were added in later kits. And I mean, a lot of that is to do with the fact that we're rushing out equipment to theaters, the urgency of it. But I'm not super knowledgeable on the signals technology during this time frame. I would recommend doing your own reading or finding an expert in that area, because I don't want to lead you astray.
Okay, thank you. And then Trent added the comment: the crossover from horse cavalry to pure mechanized formations was not clear-cut in World War II. Soviet cavalry mechanized formations were still useful into 1944 on the Eastern Front. So it's it is a dilemma that all the nations are still grappling with, the role of cavalry and mechanization. So that's a good point there. Philip Blood asked the question earlier, Matthew, about well, I'll read it. I would ask Matthew, what did the U.S. Army's Inspector Generals think of all these proposals? So that was kind of when you were talking about like the 35, 36 kind of era, pre-Spanish Civil War, when war isn't quite as much on the horizon as it was a couple of years later.
I don't have in my at my fingertips any specific quotes from any Inspector Generals. The War Department and the Department of the Army as a whole, they didn't have a ton of money to dedicate to the problem. They also were kind of hoping that the involved branches were going to figure this thing out. I'm sure the Inspector Generals had things to say about it. I don't know what they were, though.
Okay, thank you. And then what was the other one I was going to ask? Steel and armor development. So, I mean, to make tanks, you've got to have the raw ingredients. So, did you, in your research, was there anything about the steel plants and those kind of people looking at what they were doing with steel? Because this whole idea of who is leading it is doctrine leading design, is design leading doctrine, but they've also got to have raw materials. So in the sort of the late 20s, 30s, was there any attempt to kind of harness what steel plants are doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the U.S. steel industry was massive at the time, probably the most developed in the world. The types of face hardened steel that was being used hadn't been rolled homogeneous steel hadn't been perfected. So this is all face hardened as opposed to like work hardened steel. But the going thinking at the time was, even for medium and light tanks, that you didn't need that much armor. A quarter inch of steel, as the famous saying goes, stops a half ounce of lead. But yeah, there was a whole series of experiments during this time that the Ordnance Department did, and which they wrote about extensively in their journal, about various armor thicknesses, compositions of like how much nickel do you add in there, how much manganese do you put in there, how much should be carbonized, should carbonization be a process, Is the Bessemer process still applicable, or do we need to figure something else out? Is cold rolled or hot rolled the best? Yeah, they were writing all about that, and all of these journals are available online, which is very fortunate. The Cavalry Journal, the Infantry Journal, and the Ordnance Journal, all available in digitized collections from the Army Maneuver Center of Excellence or through JSTOR if you have access to that.
Well, thank you for that. And I think my last kind of comment before we bring things to end is this ongoing dilemma about the notion of you're only the cool kid if you come up with the idea first. And I'm referring to anything, whether it's code breaking, jets, atomic power, is that sometimes actually waiting for the enemy to decide what they're doing and then reacting to it is a simpler process and possibly more cost effective, in that all the British, when we have Phil Knight on doing the British tank development, when that comes up in a couple of days' time, the British are going for exactly the same but different dilemmas as the US were all through the 20s and 30s, because as we said earlier, no one quite knows which way the wind is going to blow in the future. So in a weird way, because in the end the Allies did defeat the Third Reich, they did come up with solutions better to Blitzkrieg, and they have the sheer amount of logistics and stuff. Letting the Axis go first, you could say, was actually the best move the British and Americans and Canadians could have made.
I tend to agree with you, Paul. The Second World War, much like the First, has such a specific set of circumstances. The way in which it came together, the fronts that were being engaged upon, the technologies that were maturing. I think the way that the United States and even Britain, we got the book by Dick Taylor, The Second War Tank Crisis.
Yeah.
A lot of these nations kind of get the business about they messed up with their tanks. And a lot of this is because there's a lot of enthusiasts out there who look at an object out of context, a German Panther, or a KV-2, and they're like, so cool. This is a tank. And so they say, well, the United States didn't have anything like this. Why not? It must be because they were worse. I mean, it's just not the case. One, it's not how, strategic thinking goes. And it's definitely not how design and development goes. The United States needed, as I said, something that was not overly heavy. It was reliable, packed a punch, could travel with the infantry. They could afford to build a metric ton of M4. How many M4s is it? 50,000 medium?
68,000 hulls, including what they use for self-propelled guns and things. Yeah.
So, the way in which we handled, I say we as, the United States of America, the way that the United States handled their entrance into the war and the equipment they brought with them, you can look back on it with hindsight and say, you were too slow. You missed the mark. You can say all of that, but the realities of the time period, and that's all history is trying to empathize with someone who lived and died long before you did. The reality is that nobody knew, first of all, and when they found out, they reacted. I mean, the Spanish Civil War happens, and they're immediately taking that advice from the front and they're implementing it in new designs. So you can't even say that they weren't acknowledging the realities of modern combat.
Yeah, no, it's a subject still ripe for more discussion and to eliminate the ideas that we have grown up with that we now realize are a little bit mythic and not quite, the cliches and the myths and things around this subject. And it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you, Matthew. So people are saying, when am I going to invite you back again? So I will invite you back again at some point. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Phil's explanation about the British tank development again and see how much is in line with this and see how much is different. But at the end of the day, I say the Allies, whatever the Allies did, they got there in the end. By 1945, they had indeed defeated the Third Reich. So it's the horses, the tortoise, and the hare, possibly as a simple way of analyzing it. But anyway, it's been brilliant talking to you, Matthew. Folks, I'm doing a special tomorrow. I'm debunking some of the rubbish said about Omaha Beach following an experience I had watching a really crappy video on YouTube this morning, not one of my own. And then we have Phil on Friday. Then I got 2 shows on Thursday. We're looking at air raid shelter in Brighton, and we're doing something else in the afternoon, which I forgot what it is. It'll come to me later on. But anyway, thanks everybody for your support. Thanks everybody for your questions. I will see you all next time. Cheers. Bye.